Gavin Newsom walked into this hearing expecting an easy victory, completely unaware that his own 304-page memoir was about to be used to dismantle his entire political image on live television. I have covered a lot of hearings on this channel, more polished ambushes, more rehearsed speeches, more politicians walking into rooms with folders full of talking points and walking out pretending nothing happened. But I have never covered one quite like this, because this one did not turn on a leaked memo, a hidden recording, or some mysterious document dragged out at the last second. It turned on a book Gavin Newsom had written about himself, carried into the room himself, placed on the table himself, and apparently never imagined could be used against him. 304 pages about you, not one page brought anyone home, was what the President of the United States said directly to Gavin Newsom with the cameras rolling. And the line landed with the kind of force political consultants spend entire careers trying to manufacture and almost never achieve, because it was short, specific, humiliating, and connected every glossy page of that memoir to the people Newsom had supposedly governed while he was busy explaining himself. Newsom opened his mouth, but for once the machinery did not produce an answer. No polished transition, no practiced counterattack, no smooth detour into percentages or economic rankings, just a brief, empty space where the voice that had carried him through 2 decades of television appearances suddenly failed to arrive. He looked down at the book sitting in front of him, the book with his name on the cover, closed it slowly with both hands, then pressed his palms over the title with a strange finality, almost as if the problem were not what had just been said, but the physical existence of the object that had allowed it to be said so cleanly. The book was called Young Man in a Hurry, and by the end of that morning, the title no longer sounded like branding, aspiration, or autobiography. It sounded like an accidental admission from a politician who had spent years rushing toward the next microphone, the next national stage, the next favorable headline, while insisting that California remained the permanent center of his political universe. 12 minutes earlier, none of that was visible because Gavin Newsom entered the hearing room exactly the way Gavin Newsom usually entered political rooms. Confident, camera-ready, composed down to the smallest gesture, carrying a copy of his own book under his arm, with the easy self-assurance of a man who believed the object would reinforce the image he had spent years building, rather than become the instrument that stripped it apart. He set the book beside his microphone and smiled across the table at Donald Trump. The familiar smile of a politician who had survived hostile interviews, partisan hearings, recall attempts, scandals, national criticism, and endless television combat, and who had every reason to believe that whatever came next could be managed with the same combination of speed, charm, statistics, deflection, and confidence that had worked so many times before. At the other end of the table, however, Trump already had another copy of the same book, and inside it were 3 sticky notes, marking 3 places that would slowly turn Newsom's carefully constructed memoir into something far less flattering than the author intended. Because the power of those pages would not come from anyone accusing him of something new, it would come from forcing him to confront the distance between the story he printed and the record people remembered. Trump began lightly, almost casually, thanking the governor for appearing despite what he described as a packed schedule of book tours, podcasts, and Davos appearances. Then mentioning that he had read enough of the memoir to notice the personal sections, including the passages about Newsom's mother, before pivoting to the question that immediately mattered more than any autobiographical detail. California had received enormous amounts of federal money, so what exactly had Newsom done with it? Newsom responded in the style that had become almost a trademark, moving quickly through the size of California's economy, the expansion of firefighting resources, and a claimed decline in homelessness, delivering numbers with enough fluency and confidence to create the impression of an answer while still managing to slide past the sharp edge of the question itself. While Newsom talked, Trump turned a single page in the book, a tiny sound in a large hearing room, but an important one because the book was already beginning to matter more than the performance. Then a congressman asked for 60 seconds and held up a letter he said had arrived that morning from a 7. one-year-old man in Fresno. And suddenly the hearing moved away from the safe territory of GDP rankings, program budgets, and percentage claims into the kind of story numbers cannot easily absorb. The man's wife had entered a nursing home in March 2020. Newsom had signed the visitor restrictions, and for 9 months the husband drove to that facility day after day, standing outside a window and pressing his hand against the glass, sometimes able to see his wife, sometimes unable even to know whether she understood he was there, until she died in December without him being permitted to hold her hand. The congressman then pointed out that the same week she died, Gavin Newsom was at the French Laundry, and when he paused and announced that the husband was sitting in the third row, every camera in the room turned toward an elderly man in a dark suit. He did not wave, did not stand, did not perform for the room, and did not need to, because his presence carried more weight than another stack of statistics ever could. Newsom answered the story the way political executives often answer human pain when the human detail is too dangerous to engage directly, expressing sympathy and then moving immediately toward estimates about lives saved and the broader justification for California's pandemic policies, as though converting one man's memory into a statewide number could somehow neutralize the moral force of what had just been described. Trump watched the old man, watched Newsom, glanced again at the book, and the contrast became impossible to ignore. One man in the third row carried 9 months of visits to a window, while the man at the table carried 304 pages explaining himself. That was when Trump picked up the memoir and shifted the hearing from general criticism to something much more precise, noting that the book contained 304 pages about Newsom's childhood ambitions, values, and personal journey, yet apparently did not contain a page for the man sitting only a few rows away whose wife had died behind a restriction signed by the governor. He did not read the marked passage himself, and that mattered, because reading it in Trump's voice would have allowed Newsom to treat the moment as another partisan interpretation, another attack filtered through an opponent, another argument he could dismiss as hostile framing. So instead, Trump slid his copy across the table and told Newsom to read the first marked section in his own words, from his own book. Newsom opened to page 73 and read the passage strongly, because the language was his, and the belief behind it was the image he had spent years presenting. A deep attachment to California, a lifelong commitment to the state, a claim that his identity and his political purpose were rooted there so completely that the connection sounded almost permanent and inseparable. Trump let the words settle before directing Newsom to the back cover, where the publisher had printed the book tour itinerary, a list that included Nashville, Atlanta, Rock Hill in South Carolina, New York, Las Vegas, Portsmouth in New Hampshire, Miami, and London, locations that instantly transformed the Grand Declaration on page 73 from a polished statement of devotion into something far easier to challenge. Newsom was now holding both pieces of the contradiction at the same time, his own declaration of permanent California-centered commitment in one part of the book, and a national travel schedule printed in another. And for the first time that morning, the problem was not an accusation he could dismiss, because the evidence arguing with him had his name on the cover. Trump did not need to explain the contradiction, because Newsom was already holding it in his own hands. Page 73 presenting the permanent California loyalist, and the back cover presenting a politician moving through Nashville, Atlanta, South Carolina, New York, Las Vegas, New Hampshire, and London. Two versions of the same man printed inside the same object by the same publisher, with no opposition researcher required to connect them. The damage came from that simplicity, because Newsom had spent years mastering situations where an opponent threw accusations from across a studio or committee table. But this was different. Trump was not asking the room to trust him over Newsom, he was asking the room to look at Newsom's own words and then look at Newsom's own schedule. And the contradiction required almost no commentary once both pieces were visible. Trump pushed the point further, saying the worst part was not that Newsom traveled outside California, because governors travel, politicians travel, authors promote books, and nobody serious was pretending that leaving the state itself was some scandal. The problem was the arrogance underneath it, the belief that ordinary Californians would not notice the widening distance between the image Newsom sold and the life Newsom actually lived. He pointed toward the people who had been keeping count without ever being invited onto cable news. The man sitting in the third row, the shop owner closing a business in Bakersfield, the older couple deciding they could no longer afford to remain in the state where they had built their lives. People Newsom's political machinery could reduce to demographic categories and economic indicators, but who knew perfectly well when their governor was somewhere else selling a national version of himself. That was the accusation underneath page 73, not simply that Gavin Newsom left California, but that he appeared convinced Californians were too distracted, too powerless, or too politically disposable to compare the patriotic language in the memoir with the itinerary printed a few inches away. For a moment it looked as if that first sticky note might be enough to define the morning. But Newsom was not the kind of politician who surrendered a room after one clean hit, and when he finally pushed back, he did it with exactly the skill that had allowed him to survive so many previous confrontations. He stopped defending the book and attacked Trump's own record. Newsom shifted immediately to January 2025 and the Los Angeles fires, invoking the destruction of 10,000 homes, Trump's visit to California, the handshake on the tarmac, the public promises of rapid FEMA relief, and the families who remained in shelters while federal assistance moved far more slowly than those promises suggested. Reframing the hearing from a trial of Newsom's priorities into a question about Trump's responsibility during a catastrophic disaster, it landed. Because it was specific, because disaster relief was not an abstract ideological argument, and because for 15 seconds Newsom sounded less like the defensive author of a political memoir and more like the aggressive governor he had built his national reputation around, pressing a vulnerable point and forcing the room to consider whether Trump was using California's suffering as a political weapon. Reporters began writing faster. Democratic staffers visibly responded. And the energy changed enough that Newsom could feel the current moving back toward him, which was exactly the environment where he had always been most effective: a live microphone, a sharp counterattack, an opponent being pushed toward defensiveness, and a room suddenly forced to react to him instead of inspect him. But Trump refused the invitation to spend the next 10 minutes arguing about FEMA. Acknowledged that FEMA had been slow, then snapped the focus straight back to the man from Fresno by asking whether Newsom's own office had ever called him even once after his wife died behind the restrictions Newsom had signed. A short counter that prevented Newsom from turning a personal accounting into another sprawling federal dispute. That answer mattered, because Newsom's best chance of escaping the book was to make the hearing about Trump, Washington, FEMA, January 2025, or anything else large enough to bury the three sticky notes under competing controversies. And Trump simply refused to follow him there. He lowered his voice, ended the detour, and reminded the room that they had only read one marked page, then directed Newsom to the second sticky note on page 142, where the subject changed from Newsom's attachment to California to Newsom's account of his own leadership during COVID. Newsom turned to the passage and read his description of governing nearly 40 million people through the worst pandemic in a century, presenting the lockdowns, mask mandates, restrictions, and school closures as hard decisions made in the service of saving lives. The kind of retrospective leadership narrative that turns controversial choices into evidence of resolve once enough years have passed. Trump let him finish before drawing the line back to November 2020, when Californians were being told to limit Thanksgiving gatherings. Churches faced restrictions, nursing homes restricted visitors, families canceled flights, grandparents watched children through screens, and millions of people accepted painful limits because the governor had told them those sacrifices were necessary to protect one another. Then came the fact Newsom could never erase from the public memory of that year. During the same period, he was imposing those standards on everybody else. He attended the dinner at the French Laundry with 12 people, an expensive gathering with lobbyists that became a symbol precisely because it compressed the entire accusation of political hypocrisy into one unforgettable scene. Newsom had already called the dinner a mistake, already apologized, already tried to explain the circumstances. But Trump pressed the familiar contradictions again, focusing on the dispute over whether the dinner was outdoors, the photographs showing the setting, and the obvious gap between the restrictions ordinary Californians were expected to follow and the behavior of the governor who had been lecturing them about collective responsibility. He then moved to Newsom's, children attending private school in person while public school students across California were sitting at home in front of laptops, a contrast made sharper by Newsom publicly describing himself as a Zoom parent, while families without the resources or options available to the governor watched their own children lose months of normal classroom life. Newsom returned to the defense he had used before, saying the French Laundry dinner had been a mistake and that he had accepted responsibility. But Trump's argument was that political responsibility had become almost ceremonial in Newsom's hands. Something satisfied by admitting the word mistake without surrendering the power, ambition, or self-image that had produced the hypocrisy in the first place. Trump turned toward the camera and widened the accusation beyond Newsom and the committee, speaking directly to the people who had missed Thanksgiving, who had gone without Christmas visits, who had said goodbye through windows, who had watched funerals on laptop screens, and who had followed restrictions because they believed leaders would at least submit themselves to the same rules they imposed on everyone else. In the third row, the man from Fresno looked down at his hands. And the second sticky note had now done what the first one could not. Page 73 had attacked Newsom's political image. But page 142 had reopened a memory millions of people still carried, and there was still one sticky note left. That final sticky note had been sitting on the title page all morning, almost invisible compared with the pages Newsom had already been forced to read. But it was the one that turned the memoir's own branding into the sharpest accusation of the hearing, because Trump no longer needed another paragraph, another statistic, or another contradiction buried somewhere deep in the text. He only needed the 5 words printed across the cover. He picked up the book, held the title toward the cameras, and read it slowly, "Young Man in a Hurry," then looked directly at Newsom and reduced the entire morning to the simplest question he had asked so far. In a hurry to go where? The question was devastating, precisely because it required no elaborate setup. Because by then, the room had already seen the travel schedule, already heard about the man from Fresno, already revisited French Laundry, school closures, nursing home restrictions, federal money, Los Angeles fires, and the national book tour. So the title no longer floated above those facts like marketing language. It sat directly on top of them. Trump began answering his own question by pointing out where Newsom apparently had not been in such a hurry to go. Not rushing toward Los Angeles when families were watching homes burn. Not rushing back toward Sacramento when California faced a massive deficit. Not rushing to pick up the phone for people who had been waiting for government long after the cameras moved on. Then he turned the title against the author with the blunt conclusion that Newsom seemed far more eager to reach Davos, New Hampshire, and the national political circuit than to stay anchored to the state he had just described in his own book as the place he could never truly leave. Trump set the book flat on the table and stripped away the humor, because by that point the joke had already been made by the title itself, and there was no reason to decorate it further. Then he moved to the publication history that made the contradiction even uglier. The book, he said, had originally been expected in 2025, but the publisher delayed its release after Los Angeles burned, publicly citing respect for the victims, which meant even the company selling the memoir had apparently understood that promoting a governor's personal story while families were staring at destroyed neighborhoods might look grotesque. 1 year later, the book finally appeared, and Trump immediately forced the room to look at what Newsom did in that first week. Not returning his attention exclusively to burned communities or families still waiting for answers, But moving through Nashville, Atlanta, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Miami, and other stops that looked suspiciously familiar to anyone who had watched ambitious politicians test the map before a national campaign. The point was not subtle, and Trump did not pretend it was. Those were places politicians visit when they want national attention, places connected to donors, media, party networks, and early presidential state visibility, while the people who had lost homes in California were still living with the consequences of the disaster that had been serious enough to postpone Newsom's book in the first place. That was when Trump delivered the phrase that sat heavier than any number on the table, because it summarized the priority structure he had been building toward from the first sticky note. The book could wait. Your ambition couldn't. The room absorbed that sentence because it connected every separate piece at once. The memoir delayed because of suffering in California. The publication restarted when the moment became more convenient. The national stops beginning immediately. The title announcing a man in a hurry, and the governor's own language, insisting that California was the center of his identity. Every trip outside the state now looked different inside the frame Trump had built. Every podcast appearance became harder to separate from personal positioning. Every handshake in New Hampshire carried the shadow of neighborhoods in California, where families were still trying to rebuild. And every polished statement about commitment had to compete with a schedule that looked increasingly like preparation for something larger than governing Sacramento. Trump pushed the argument beyond simple absence and toward motive, saying the real issue was that everything else seemed capable of waiting. The people, the businesses, the families, the neighborhoods, the consequences, while the one thing that could not wait was Gavin Newsom's own assent. That was the brutal center of the attack. Not that Newsom had failed at every policy, because governors fail. Not that he had traveled, because governors travel. Not even that he had ambitions beyond California, because ambitious politicians are hardly rare. But that he had built an entire public identity around caring deeply, while repeatedly behaving in ways that made the caring look like part of the presentation. Trump then said the line that moved the hearing from criticism of performance to criticism of character. People don't hate you because you failed, Governor. Governors fail all the time. People hate you because you pretended to care so well that they almost believed you. That accusation was vicious because it did not attack competence alone, it attacked sincerity. And for a politician whose greatest strength had always been presentation, the ability to look directly into a camera and make every policy choice sound personal, urgent, compassionate, and inevitable sincerity was the foundation beneath almost everything else. Trump pointed to the image of Newsom at Davos, holding a glass of champagne and talking about living rent-free in political opponents' heads, while Californians displaced by disaster were sleeping on cots, living in temporary spaces, or carrying their possessions in bags because the homes that once contained their lives were gone. He described the families who had spent years saying privately what they believed about Newsom, telling children and neighbors that the polished concern felt fake, only to be dismissed as partisan, bitter, misinformed, or trapped inside conservative media. People who had learned to swallow the argument because every time they said the governor did not care, somebody else told them they were simply being unfair. Trump's point was that those people had not lacked evidence. They had lacked the moment when the evidence could be compressed into something undeniable. A moment when Newsom's own book, own words, own schedule, own title, and own history could all be placed on the same table without anyone needing a 3-0 minute cable segment to explain the contradiction. And now, after 3 sticky notes and 12 minutes, Trump argued that the people who had carried that judgment for years were not wrong. They had simply never before watched somebody force Gavin Newsom to read the evidence back into the record in his own voice. Then Trump returned to the book one last time, looked at the cover, looked at Newsom, and brought the entire hearing back to the sentence that had been waiting at the end of the road from the moment the first page turned. 304 pages about you. Not one page brought anyone home. The room became so quiet that the object on the table seemed louder than the people around it. because the book that had entered the hearing as a trophy had now become a physical record of everything Trump had accused Newsom of prioritizing. Hundreds of pages spent defining Gavin Newsom, while the people used throughout the hearing existed almost entirely outside its story. Newsom opened his mouth and began with, "Mr. President, the polished reflex appearing for a fraction of a second, the same trained instinct that had rescued him from countless hostile moments. But this time, the sentence stopped before it became an argument, and the silence that followed was more damaging than another minute of Trump speaking could have been." He looked down at the book, at his own words, at his own name on the cover, then closed it slowly with both hands and pressed his palms flat across the title with a strange finality, as if the safest thing left to do was physically cover the object that had just been used to dismantle the image it was written to preserve. The chairman finally asked whether the governor wished to continue, and Gavin Newsom, a politician who had built a career on always having another answer ready, looked at the closed memoir under his hands and said only 2 words, "No further." And then he stayed there, which in some ways was worse than leaving, because walking out would at least have given him movement, an exit, something for the cameras to follow. But sitting still meant the country could remain fixed on the exact image he could no longer control. Gavin Newsom behind his nameplate, the book closed beneath both hands, the title covered, the voice gone. He did not reach for water, did not turn toward an aide, did not whisper for a document, did not make any of those small mechanical gestures politicians use to signal that a difficult moment has passed and the machinery of public life is moving forward again. Because nothing was moving forward in that room, and everybody understood it. For the first time in a career built around filling dead air before anyone else could fill it for him, Newsom was trapped inside a silence that could not be reframed, corrected, redirected, softened, or buried beneath another statistic. The irony was almost cruel, because the man who had made speed part of his political personality suddenly had nowhere to hurry. The charm had not worked, the counterattack on FEMA had not lasted, the statistics had not dissolved the man from Fresno, and walking out with "young man in a hurry" under his arm would have turned Trump's argument into a visual punchline too obvious even for television producers to improve. So Newsom remained seated, his hands covering the name on the cover, while the room discovered that silence from a politician famous for talking could be louder than any speech he might have delivered. Within an hour, the clip was everywhere. But what spread fastest was not another Trump line, not another raised voice, not another partisan exchange that people could cut into competing versions and argue over for the next 3 days. It was the 10 seconds of Newsom closing the book and pressing both palms down over his own name. That image required almost no caption, because the symbolism was already complete. A man who had written hundreds of pages explaining who he was had just watched those pages become evidence against the image they were supposed to strengthen. And now the same hands that had carried the memoir into the room were covering the title from the cameras. The sequence looped again and again, because modern politics lives on moments that communicate before anyone begins explaining them. And this one communicated instantly. The book had arrived as a trophy, turned into an exhibit, and ended the morning looking like something its author wanted, removed from view. No complicated graphic was required. No panel of strategists had to translate the meaning. No scrolling chyron could improve the basic visual of Gavin Newsom physically pressing down on a book called "Young Man in a Hurry" after being asked where exactly he had been in such a hurry to go. And the deeper problem for Newsom was that the image did not merely show embarrassment, it compressed the entire hearing into one frame. The glossy political identity on the cover disappearing underneath the hands of the man who had spent the previous 12 minutes watching that identity collide with his own record. That evening, according to the account unfolding around the hearing, no major Democratic leader rushed forward with a statement defending him. No immediate public rescue operation appeared. No carefully coordinated wall of allies tried to turn the morning into an attack on Trump. And in politics, that kind of silence is rarely meaningless. Politicians understand better than almost anyone that defending a colleague is itself a calculation, especially when the clip is already moving faster than any talking point. And sometimes the safest response is not to argue that the audience misunderstood what it saw, but to say nothing and hope the cycle burns itself out. Yet silence had become the theme of the day, first in Newsom's unfinished answer, then in the room after the final line, and finally in the absence of the kind of partisan response that usually arrives within minutes when a nationally prominent governor takes a public beating. The hearing had begun with Newsom surrounded by the usual protections of status, experience, party identity, media fluency, and the expectation that whatever happened could eventually be spun into another debate over competing narratives. But the ending resisted that machinery because the visual was too simple and the source material was his own. He had not been confronted with an anonymous allegation or a speculative accusation that allies could dismiss as invented. He had been confronted with a memoir he wrote, a tour schedule his publisher printed, memories Californians already carried, and a title that suddenly sounded like commentary on everything he was accused of prioritizing. After the hearing, the old man from Fresno walked out of the Rayburn building in the same dark suit he had worn while sitting in the third row, moving past reporters, staffers, press vehicles, phones, microphones, and all the machinery surrounding an event that had just become national political content. Nobody needed him for the television version of the story because he was not a senator, governor, strategist, commentator, donor, or celebrity. He was simply the man whose wife had entered a nursing home in 2020 and whose final months with her had been reduced to standing outside a window with his hand against the glass. He did not come to Washington to give a speech, challenge Newsom at a microphone, or build a public profile out of his grief. And that was exactly why his presence had been more damaging than another partisan witness could have been. Because there was nothing theatrical about a 71-year-old man sitting quietly and looking at the governor whose policy had defined the last months of his marriage. He stood on the steps for a long time, still wearing the suit associated with a loss he had carried since December 2020, and looked upward without checking a phone or chasing the cameras that had spent the morning turning every political gesture inside the building into footage. He had come because he wanted to be in the room where Gavin Newsom would have to look into the gallery and know that somewhere beyond all the percentages, all the explanations, and all the pages about leadership sat one human being who remembered exactly what those decisions had cost. And maybe that is why the story stayed with people longer than the ordinary political clash. Because beneath the personalities, the memoir, the insults, the ambition, and the national positioning was a simpler grievance that had been sitting inside millions of Americans since 2020. They had been told to sacrifice by leaders who did not always appear willing to live under the same sacrifice themselves. Families, missed Thanksgivings, Christmases, hospital visits, funerals, graduations, classrooms, and final goodbyes, because they believed the rules were serious enough to demand obedience. And every image of a powerful official behaving differently carved another notch into a distrust that statistics never fully repaired. Many of those people had spent years trying to explain that anger to children, friends, neighbors, or relatives who dismissed them as partisan, exaggerated, bitter, or trapped inside whatever media ecosystem the other side already disliked. And eventually, some simply stopped arguing, because being told repeatedly that what they remembered did not matter can exhaust even the most patient person. Then they watched Gavin Newsom place his hands over his own book after Trump connected the memoir to the French Laundry, the nursing home restrictions, the private school contrast, the national travel, the fires, the old man in the third row, and the question of who exactly benefited from 304 pages devoted to the governor's own story. For those viewers, the satisfaction was not that every political question in California had suddenly been solved. It was that somebody had finally said on camera, and directly to the man at the center of their resentment, the thing they had spent years believing nobody with a microphone would ever say clearly enough. That is why the final line carried more weight than another accusation about ambition could have carried on its own. Because 304 pages about you, not one page brought anyone home, reduced a massive political persona to a brutal measurement of usefulness, asking what any of that self-description had actually done for the people whose lives had become footnotes to the governor's national story. The memoir remained 304 pages long after the hearing. The title remained Young Man in a Hurry. The tour schedule remained printed where it had always been, and nothing physically about the book changed. Yet the meaning of the object had been completely reversed. Because every page now existed under the shadow of the question Trump forced Newsom to answer without allowing him to escape into abstraction. The morning had started with a governor carrying a book that was supposed to define him, and ended with the same governor pressing his hands over it while an old man from Fresno sat only a few rows away, carrying a memory no publisher had polished and no political consultant had written. That contrast is what survived after the cameras moved on. 304 pages of explanation on one side, 12 minutes of confrontation on the other, and a silence in between that Gavin Newsom for once could not talk his way out of. Young Man in a Hurry had been written as the title of Gavin Newsom's story. But inside that hearing room it became the question hanging over everything else. Hurried toward what? Hurried for whom? And if the people he governed were still waiting, what exactly had all that hurry ever been?